So thank you everybody for joining. We had a great group here, and I think we're online and we're streaming live. So thanks for coming, everybody. And we've got a here with a lot to cover here. So want to get started here. I guess the things that we wanted to cover today before we get into introductions, I wanted to just give us a brief. We went through USGS gave us a lot of great information last month on conditions in the lake. I want to see if anybody had any quick update, kind of anecdotal observations. I wanted to give Jim Harris here. There. Jim is online. All right, a chance to update on a few things, and then obviously the big point that we wanted to cover today was just talking about modifications to the berm on Union Pacific Causeway, and I sent the committee members a draft list of recommendations, just identifying goals and objectives for the changes. The kind of basis for it, and I wanted to be able to talk about that too. So a lot to cover there, and appreciate all of your interest in attending today. So we can just go around the room. I know we've got a number of people online. We have 18 people online in addition to our full house here. So if we can just start, Ben, if you want to start.
Yeah,
with
Ben,
your name and who you're with.
Ben Starman, I'm with the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Marissa Weinberg, also Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Joe Havasu, Compass Minerals.
Tony Rampton, Utah Attorney General's Office.
Kathy Davis, Utah Attorney General's Office.
Tom Tripp, USMag.
George Young.
Mark Middle, US Magnesium.
Ryan Rowland, USGS.
Christine Rumsey, USGS.
Linda Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Alex Phillips, Duke University, collaborating with Great Salt Lake Institute.
Carly Beal, Westminster College, Great Salt Lake Institute.
Steele's Great Salt Lake Ground Shrimp Cooperative.
Bill Brown, the Great Salt Lake Ground Shrimp Cooperative.
Our Altova Policy Coordinating Office. Laura Vernon, Division of Water Resources.
Elliot Jeknecki, UGS.
Andrew Rupke, Utah Geological Survey.
Kyle Stone, Division of Wildlife Resources.
Jennifer Bates, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Tim Hawks, Ground Shrimp Cooperative.
And Jeff DenBleyker Jacobs is facilitating here today. And we got the back row there.
Oh, sure. Christian Dell, Compass Minerals.
Kyle Maynard, Utah Attorney General's Office.
Emma Whitaker, Utah Attorney General's Office.
Mike Begley, AG's Office.
All right, and then online, is there a way we can see the list of, if you wouldn't mind? All right, I guess they see a different list than we do, but Ben Holcomb is with Division of Water Quality, Craig Miller is with Division of Water Resources, David O'Leary is with USGS, Jim Harris is with Division of Water Quality, Jody Gardberg is with Division of Water Quality, John Ray, is that Jack? That's Jack Ray. Krishna Khatri with Division of Water Resources, Layla Ahmadi with Division of Water Resources, Rob Dubuque, still with Western Resources or Friends?
Friends.
Friends, all right. And is that everybody?
Yeah, the rest are just EV stuff.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I guess a couple of items on order here. I sent out a meeting summary to the committee members for review from our last meeting in December, and wanted to see if anybody had any comments on those. Andrew had a minor comment that just attributing, I think I attributed something to you versus Christine, so we'll fix that.
Just wanted to give you.
I think it was a good thing. Okay. Any comments on the summary from committee members?
Nice job.
If there aren't any questions or comments, entertain a motion to approve that. We can finalize that.
Move. I'll second. They were represented as far as I could tell.
All right, we always have the YouTube video to check it. So, if all those committee members, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And anybody opposed? All right, approved unanimously. Thank you. So the next item on the agenda here is just with Great Salt Lake conditions. You know, I know the number of folks here are actively involved out in the field, like operations on the lake, research on the lake, monitoring. Anything that, I guess, any observations here over the last month?
The lake level is definitely coming up right now. So as of yesterday, the south arm was at 4189.3. And you'll recall, I think the historic low is going to be about 4188.5. So we are up about 0.8 feet, which is great. Okay, that's the south arm. The elevation difference between the north and the south arm right now is about 0.5 feet, with the south arm being about a half foot higher than the north arm. So we're seeing the right trend for the south arm. The elevation's coming up for sure.
We're seeing flow going to the north arm right now.
Yes, we are.
That differential.
The last discharge measurement we made at the new breach was on December 8th. We measured 258 cubic feet per second moving from south to north. We measured 5 CFS moving from north to south. And that low discharge value is associated with a lot of error. There's a lot of noise in velocity data because the velocities are so slow in that direction.
Great. Thank you. Any changes in the salinity measurements? Andrew, you said you're going back out next week.
Yeah.
Jeff, I'll just say, the GSLEP did go out November 30th, just, and you had mentioned in your kind of memo, it said November 22nd, it was 187. As of November 30th, we saw a range in surface salinity of 170 to 186. So kind of depending on where we were, but seeing a little freshening in some areas,
Yeah.
especially near Bear River Bay outflow.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing some inflow at Bear River and like that, and right there by Antelope is kind of driving everything down. Our surface measurements are down to like 17.2 on average, but that's largely driven by those two sites. We're still 19 in some areas.
European Union has a Sentinel satellite. If you go to their Sentinel hub online, you can see their latest imagery. And just in the last week or two, you can see where all the ice is on the lake. So you can see where the fresh water is coming in and accumulating. So that was interesting. Good. Anything else? Anybody? The brine shrimp cooperative, have you been out at all? I imagine you have. What you do.
We attempted a sample run last week, but we had a boat issue halfway through. So we had a few sample sites in the northwest area, and salinities were below 18% at those 4 sites. That's closer to the Bear River inflow. We're not sure what it would be farther south.
Okay. Excellent. Well, good. Well, that's helpful because I think one of the things we learned as the committee's done its work for the last several years has just been that the observations, the data has really been what's been driving our discussion and trying to develop strategies for the lake. So I think these monthly updates and how we're certainly helping our understanding the dynamics out there. So the next item on our agenda was just update on the Friends of Great Salt Lake request. And I asked Jim if he could give us an update on that. That was brought up, I believe, last month or 2 months ago. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, can I share my screen, Jeff?
Yeah.
let's see. Yeah, I apologize for not being there in person. I was feeling a little under the weather today, and I thought I'd stay away from people. Let me expand that 1 second. Yeah, as Jeff indicated, and as I mentioned in the last meeting, we received a request from Friends of the Great Salt Lake to issue an emergency assessment of Gilbert Bay as either threatened or impaired. And that's, as I introduced to this group, and I'll kind of recap, that's those are some assessment categories that we use for reporting to EPA every 2 years in our integrated report. We were required to assess all available data and make a determination on the status of state waters and report that. And so we've never done an emergency request, and so we've been deliberating on this for since we got the letter and how to best approach it. And so I kind of want to walk everyone through the what we're thinking here today. So a little bit of background information. The integrated report that we provide every 2 years is it is based upon an evaluation of the standards and the criteria of each water body and for a number of different pollutants. The classification for the Gilbert Bay is unique. It's class 5A, frequent primary and secondary contact recreation, waterfowl, shorebirds, and other water-oriented wildlife, including their necessary food chain. And so, in essence, the aquatic life use includes the brine shrimp, the brine flies, birds, algae, and other microorganisms that inhabit the lake as a whole. So we only have one criterion developed for Gilbert Bay, and that's a shorebird egg tissue criteria to assess. And so currently we have a classification of Gilbert Bay as category 2, and that's a category in our integrated report, which basically says that some, but not all of the uses have been assessed. And feel free to interject any questions if you guys have any along the way.
Yes, Jim, what does category 2 refer to?
It specifically refers to that some of the uses, but not all of them, are assessed. And because that's a bird egg, so recreation is not included in that assessment, but the aquatic life for shorebirds is assessed through that tissue-based criterion. But not all of the uses, like recreation, are assessed.
What are other class 2 waters in the state? Are there any?
Oh, boy, yes. And a lot of times it might be because we don't have available data. You know, we might have criteria associated with all of the uses, but we don't have available data. In some cases, we have we might not have criteria developed for those. But yeah, and Jody, I don't know if you have a couple off the top of your head. That Jody's our integrated report program manager.
So I missed that. Do we have other class 2 waters you know of?
Yeah. Go ahead, Jody.
I was just going to say they're categories. It's categories 1 through 5, and 1 is fully supporting the beneficial uses against the standards. Category 2 is partially supporting. Category 3 is insufficient data. Category 4 is a TMDL is in place generally. And then category 5 is impaired. And this category 2 is because we only have one standard, it's only what we call partially supporting. And there's dozens of category 2s out there. The classes refer to the beneficial use classes, which is different. Is that what you're looking for, Tom?
No, I was looking for a couple of examples of other class 2 waters in the state.
category 2. Yeah, I could come up with some examples while Jim is presenting.
I'd almost wager that's probably our most common category. is
Right.
category 2.
I think it's 30% of our water bodies that were assessed are category 2, some high number like that.
Thank you.
Okay. So this group is more than aware of this, so I'm going to kind of fly through these next few slides because essentially everyone here has either worked on this directly or is more than knowledgeable on the cause and effect of what we're looking at here. So lake elevation is the driving factor that we are evaluating, looking at, as Ryan mentioned, we've reached an all-time low at 4188 and a half in November. And this has been the general trend of the lake for the last, this is 40 years. One of the key elements in the lake elevation drop is the impact it has on the microbialite habitat and distribution. It's been exposing a lot of this. You're well aware of this. This is I believe a UGS graphic that was put out in July that shows the affected areas in the shallower waters of the lake. And important to that is that microbial habitat for brine fly larvae. And then the resulting salinity increases that have been occurring as a result of this declining elevation, which again, you all understand the risk and what we're concerned about with the crash in the brine fly and brine ship populations as a result of this. And then you're intimately aware of the work that you guys did with respect to the biological thresholds for salinity. And I want to make sure that one thing I want to point out about this is that, as you know, you guys identified these ideal ranges for key biota in the lake. The highlighted ones are the microbialites, the brine flies, and the brine shrimp. The dotted line shows us roughly where we are at today or as of November, outside of those ideal ranges. And I want to make sure we don't conflate these thresholds and how we're going to use them with a criterion. We're not proposing that it be looked at as a criterion or as an endpoint, but it does provide the foundation of understanding what are the tolerances for these key species and what might be the result of going beyond those in terms of high salinity and how that might affect the ecosystem. Because there's often talk about not having criteria and some things like that. I just want to make sure we're clear that that's not how we're proposing to use this. But given the state of the science, though, I think this is very valid to say, look, this is of great concern. So as I mentioned, Friends requested that we put out an emergency threatened assessment. And barring any, numeric criteria, we are what we're looking at is an application of our narrative water quality standard, which basically states that concentrations or combinations of substances which produce undesirable responses in the biota are a clear violation of our Utah's water quality rules. So what we're considering is recategorizing the Gilbert Bay biological community as category 5 threatened. The category 5 threatened is a definition in our integrated report is one or more of the uses are likely to become impaired by the next integrated report cycle. We feel like this gives us an opportunity to work on a justification to look and see if the trend does continue in the coming year or years, and make a final determination about the status of the lake in future integrated report cycles. And we would append the existing integrated report, which has already been approved by EPA. We would append this assessment to it and then reconfirm it in 2024, which already started that reporting cycle with a final determination in 2026. That's kind of the long-term timeline we're looking at. So we've been thinking a lot about this as well in terms of implications. What does this mean to our other programs? Because the driving factor is lake elevation, we don't see a lot of permit implications for us in terms of would this change the permit limits for dischargers in the basin or to the lake, because it's driven largely by the salt mass that's in the lake and that dynamic of as water levels drop, the relative salinity level increases. And then, I think the most important aspect of this is that we, as a division, can contribute and communicate and support ongoing strategies through this determination. Hopefully, to direct additional resources to the Great Salt Lake. We have a concurrent program that we just started that I think fits and might contribute to this in terms of development of environmental flow procedures to look at what are adequate flows in rivers and streams to protect aquatic life uses, but that could also speak to the integrated watershed assessment that's just beginning with this from the House Bill 429, because there are some provisions in there looking at flow, base flows and things like that in rivers and streams. And so I think we might be able to bring some resources to the table with respect to that, and then support all the other ongoing efforts intended to increase flows to the Great Salt Lake, ag water conservation, M&I conservation, and all the legal mechanisms that are in play, and then anything that might come out of this year's legislative efforts. So future work, and I mentioned the House Bill 429 and integrated watershed assessment, and on some of our environmental flow procedures. I think we can contribute to that process, and also another category in our integrated report is what we call a Category 5 alt, or an advanced restoration plan. Typically, an impaired water body or a threatened water body would require the development of what we call a total maximum daily load. It's a watershed assessment that looks at all of the sources and puts limits on sources to get it back into compliance with water quality standards. That wouldn't be the avenue we would take, given the dynamic of what we're looking at here. It is a water quantity issue that we see, but I think that a lot of the things that could come out of the IWA could be effectively an advanced restoration plan for the lake, and it would be most likely adopted as to meet that need. So we looked at, down the road at the completion of that project, this could get it out of the threatened status and have a restoration plan in place. So I guess I'll take a moment if anyone has some questions about that before I shift gears and talk about the second thing that I was asked to provide an update.
Any questions on the
Has water quality, this is Tripp talking again, has water quality come to an idea of where the threshold of impaired is, or where threatened is? Where do we have to be so we're no longer implementing things and into the recovery period under your thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question. Was that Tom? Sorry.
it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, because like I said, we're not using the ideal thresholds that you guys have developed for the salinity as a criterion. So, they're a weight of evidence. And so we would likely, apply the same weight of evidence to say, hey, look, this, like for instance, if we have a great water year or a couple great water years in the interim, and it comes back into that ideal range, I think we can use the same justification to say, look, this is not threatened.
I'm just concerned when
when you look at how EPA typically does this, they have 5 stages.
Mhm.
Listed, which takes at least 2 years normally. Then they go through a planning phase where they figure out what standards they're going to apply to the problem. And then they go into implementation and monitor and improving
Mhm.
and recovery. And I just think the concern I have is that we have kind of an amorphous standard. We've got people who are dealing with no problems that are close to being like this. They're all dealing with keeping pollution out of water. In
Mhm.
this case, we're trying to add more water to a lake that's very saline. I'm concerned that things will be crossing over. They'll go after water rights type issues. And I think that would be a taking under our state law, or could be considered that. You can take water away from farmers or other kind of industry or municipalities. I just think you're getting yourself in a very dangerous ground to bring the EPA in at this point. I think it would be a situation where it'll slow down any state action because the EPA will want to have their input on anything we choose to do that might be right. And I just don't see what they're going to bring to the table that will help the state. Those are kind of my general concerns.
And duly noted. I think, this is and we talked about this last week, but it bears repeating for this group. This is a delegated program. The integrated report is delegated to the states to make their decisions on the status of the water based on anything, based on our state standards and the interpretation of those state standards. And also, I think this is where we have a plan forward in terms of if we also have delegated authority to do the implementation of any strategies to remediate water quality problems. And so, I don't see an issue where they would interfere with us as a state developing taking this integrated watershed assessment and looking at the implementation strategies that come out of that and making that our de facto plan for the lake. They wouldn't have oversight over that. they would only at the close of that process either accept it or deny it in terms of, is that a suitable restoration strategy? But that really is the limit of that. And I think we can make all those justifications to make sure that meets the what's required. I don't know if Jody or Ben, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess maybe I agree. I think this is a state decision. EPA is not making this decision to, consider the lake threatened. They could if they wanted, but this is, as Jim mentioned, this is our delegated authority to do this, and it's the state's decision to make and fulfill if so desired. And so I guess to get to the second point that you raised, Tom, in terms of developing limits and that sort of thing, that's where Jim was pointing out for this water body, it doesn't make sense to take that approach, that total maximum daily load approach. We would recommend an approach that's targeting restorative practices rather than limits on permits, for example. So typically that's, a typical listing results in TMDLs, but in this case, we don't see that that's a path forward to take an approach where we're limiting pollutants going into the lake, because we're already doing that. We already have limits on TDS to protect our local water bodies where discharges occur. And so we couldn't, permit our way out of this, so to speak, in any way imaginable. So it would require a restoration plan that would just go straight towards looking at strategies for improvement.
So do you guys have a preliminary plan already then, Benjamin?
No,
You're just going from blank paper right now.
Yeah, so typically it's, first is just, acknowledging that there's a problem. right? The road to recovery is to first admit there's a problem, and then we'll, work with our partners, many of you here at the table, to develop those strategies. And so that's the approach that we're viewing at this point.
Joe?
Yeah, the one of the items that was mentioned was, the likelihood of one or more uses likely to be impaired. I think it's obvious, like what those are, but like what explicitly, the salinity condition, the condition of the brine shrimp. What are the specific triggers you have in mind to found that likelihood? And again, not disagreeing, but I think we should be explicit on certain things. What those suspected areas are, and then what are criteria. So we, the Salinity Advisory Committee came up with the ideal salinity range, with 16% being the high end. We're sitting at 18.7%. It would be good to really identify what are various milestones between 18.7 and 16, and various triggers of either additional protection or release of measures. And I think before we head down a road, I think there should be some identification of what those triggers are.
Did you hear the question, Jim?
Yes, yeah, and it's a good point, Joe, and why kind of I tried to clarify the use of those thresholds and distinguishing that from a de facto criterion, because I think some of the weight of evidence, and we have some time to look into this with issuing a threatened status and making it a final determination down the line. But I would think that without an actual criterion on the books in terms of our water quality rules, we have, it is open to discussion to identify other indices, for instance, brine shrimp population or brine fly populations, or maybe some reproductive rate or something along those lines that could be used as an indicator to add to this evaluation of whether it's threatened or impaired or not. So those things yet to be determined, but I think that we would rely, I think, heavily on the expertise of the people in this room to assist us with defining what does that look like for the biota. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, if that's how you envision that.
Yeah, I think a lot of those, values, metrics, indices, et cetera, even though we don't have these goals established yet, but I think that would be part of the strategy going forward, would be identifying targets, the frequency of excursions from those targets, and the duration of that excursion, identifying some of those targets in that way that would be part of the the restoration strategy.
So it's just to be clear, and we've been watching, just to clarify, try to make sure we answer your question. And we've been watching the lake level go down for quite some time, but it really has been salinity that has been of concern, right, Jim? And that, and the fact that we are above the ideal range of salinity in Great Salt Lake, in addition to some of the impacts that have been observed over the last 3 to 6 months, is really what spurred, I guess, you listing it as threatened and putting it in category 5.
But there's been some time where we've been north of 16%. And, understanding, my layman's understanding is above 18% is really severe. But understanding between 18.7 and 16, where do we kind of get back into the yellow area?
Right.
Or, it is, because we weren't taking this action when it went north of 16. Like, it feels like we significantly accelerated. And not judging rightly or wrong. So, but like what are the milestones between 18.7 and 16?
Yeah, I think even that threshold chart has, there's a gradient of color for a reason. and I think it's because we're learning this with the science, but we're trying to learn what those thresholds are. And so I think, and I guess also, to recap what you were saying, Jim, is that now that it's been listed as threatened, you're going to amend the 2022 integrated report listed as threatened. And what that does now is that starts the process for you to make a determination on that as part of your 2024 integrated reporting cycle.
Right.
Correct?
Correct.
And so that, I think, and you guys are the experts, but that process, the intent of that process is to develop the rationale, the criteria for why is this threatened, and where are those key benchmarks. Is that right?
Correct.
As part of the cycle. That
Yeah.
you'll be-
So it does buy us some time to layer in additional lines of evidence and answer some of these questions that you brought up with regard to that. We do, just so you know, we do have another process. This a separate process every 3 years. We have a triennial review of our standards. The idea of what you were talking about, Joe, in terms of what's the gradation between these thresholds. Again, I want to separate it from the development of a standard per se, because we would have to have a standard in our standards or a criterion in our standards to be able to look at it in those terms. And that's a long process. It's an involved process. It's not something that we couldn't entertain for the lake. It's certainly something that could be something we can entertain in terms of developing a new standard for the lake. But understand that is a long and involved process, and it may be a very complicated one. But we didn't see that not having a standard would necessarily preclude us from making a determination, an interpretation of the narrative standard to support a threatened listing for the lake.
One final comment, maybe. We've had dealings with EPA on the lake before. There was a time they wanted to call us an impaired body because we had cyanobacteria higher than the standard, not realizing that was an important feedstock for brine shrimp in our lake. There was a time when water quality was proposing, wasn't it, Jody, to go to a sodium standard in the lake? I thought that was a strange standard to have come out. I think
that must have been before my time, because pre-2012 or something like that. But the cyanobacteria was a concern. Yes. Go ahead.
This is just a deal where I think we're a little premature on this. If we don't have the idea of where we want to go, going to EPA, they do not know. The experts are here in this state, not over at Region 8. And I think if you set them on a course of developing a plan, it will slow things rather than accelerate. And as we sat around this table, I think we've realized this is an important topic for everybody here. And I think if you go to the expertise here, we can move more agilely and more quickly than if we try to drag a big agency like the EPA into the arena. Because, look at their 303 plan. They're going to do planning on this with the state, no doubt. They're going to do planning. And they're going to want to approve the plan, and they're going to want to monitor the plan. And I just think by pushing into this, we're going to get something that's going to be less agile, less expertise applied to it. I'd rather keep it here in the state.
Let me be clear, Tom. We are not asking them to do anything for us except to approve our determination, it's basically check the box that, yeah, you agree with us that we think it's threatened. We are not asking them to come in and do any sort of analysis, any sort of planning process at all. That is all delegated to the state. And so we would not be relinquishing any of that control to them. Not to say that they don't have some oversight to check another box, which is say, we'll accept that restoration plan and it meets the requirements of the Clean Water Act. That they would have some review in. But we are not turning any of this process over to them. Just to be clear, I want to make sure that folks understand that.
Hey, Jim, I just wanted to add too, we're going to do a 30-day public comment period on our recategorization document. And that'll probably start around January 17th. So Tom and others, please submit a public comment on this document.
And Jody, that amends the 2002 IR?
The 2022 IR. We thought it was so threatened that we didn't want to wait until the 2024 integrated report.
Okay, and then I wanted to make sure John left a message there. Salinity thresholds are a major concern, but habitat loss cannot be discounted too.
Agreed, John. That's kind of why I brought up that that map of the microbial habitat. Another line of evidence and justification for increasing flows.
Okay.
Other
Just to make sure we're clear though, the threatened status is more than just salinity, or it is about salinity.
So it would be about the threatened aquatic life use. So it's a, like I said, it was an interpretation of our narrative standards. So salinity and water elevation are the drivers, but the concern is that it is the biota and the waterfowl and shorebirds that rely on that biota that is of major concern. So it includes salinity.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So is one of the drivers here that it might bring in, this determination might bring in additional funding to help find solutions for the Great Salt Lake? Is that part of the mix?
It's definitely a possibility that depending on priorities that and future sources of EPA funding, possibly state funding dedicated to it. So yeah, it opens the door to emphasizing the importance of the resource and developing a restorative strategy for it.
Great. Well, good discussion. Why don't we, looking at time, what you want to continue, Jim?
Yeah, I'll be real short. I just have this one slide. So Jeff asked that I give an update. December 29th, we issued a letter, which was essentially a denial of the 401 certification for the MagCore canal continuation project.
Jim, we've been US Magnesium for 22 years. Use the right name.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I was unfortunate shorthand. So the basis of that is that we concluded that there was insufficient information to make a determination, and so what it is, the letter essentially says is that DWQ is requiring what we call a level 2 anti-degradation review within a year. And essentially that anti-degradation review includes the listed items here. So it should include a lake level and salinity analysis, looking at changes that are that may or may not result from continued withdrawal from the lake as part of this project. Looking at changes in salinity, looking at microbialite surveys and analysis, any impacts to those communities, a more thorough alternatives analysis, an environmental assessment, or an EIS if it's required by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So it was essentially, we don't have enough information to make a final determination on the water quality certification. And I don't know if Liana is online, if she would like to add any to that, because she was involved in that decision.
Yeah, all I would say is that they don't have 1 year to do it. They can come back whenever they're ready. When they have the information, they can come back and request the certification again. And it's all dialed down to we had additional information we needed, and the Corps denied it an extension of our timeline, which ultimately gets passed on to the applicant in those cases.
All right. I guess any questions? All right. Good. Well, thank you, Jim, and everybody. So I think shifting gears here over to the Causeway berm, I asked Ben if he could give us kind of last month we talked about the urgency and wanting to try to mitigate the impacts of the declining water levels, the increasing salinity in the South Arm. And we talked about raising the berm at the Union Pacific Causeway to effectively cut off the North Arm from at these current water levels. And the intent would be to capture inflows to the lake in the South Arm. And the goal there is that those inflows would raise the water level of the South Arm higher than it would if the water was also in the North Arm. So we're artificially increasing the South Arm water elevation, but we're also decreasing the evaporative area of the lake. So we're reducing the losses of the evaporative losses of water from the lake. And then the intent there obviously is to raise the water level of the South Arm as much as we can, and reduce the salinity of the South Arm as much as we can. And so I guess a couple of the action items we had last month was the state was working on modeling that concept, just looking at different scenarios of potential inflows to the lake, climate scenarios, looking at some different elevations. What does it mean? Would it provide any benefit if we were to raise the berm like that? And I think it's important. I think an important part of the discussion was that the intent here is in the lake's current paradigm where the lake is really low. The intent is that hopefully fingers crossed the lake levels will come back up, and then the berm wouldn't be needed. And that's been a premise of using the berm as a management tool all along, has been that the changes that we're making to the berm are temporary in response to the conditions that we're seeing. And so that's, we raised the berm last summer in response to the increasing salinities that we saw last winter or last year. And raising the berm to where it is now was very effective in reducing the flow from the North Arm and importing salt into the South Arm. And so now, but even with that improvement, with cutting off that source of salt for the most part, we still saw the salinities of the South Arm continue to increase. And so we talked about this berm as one of our very few, if any, management tools to try to protect those uses in the South Arm. So anyway, I guess the action items were to do some modeling and then also to try to create a straw man of goals and what the recommendations might be from this committee. And so first, let's talk about some of the discussion of the state for modeling we've been doing.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. That's captures the purpose for the modification perfectly. Where the primary goal is to reduce salinity, but there's also a secondary goal of raising the surface level of the South Arm. And I gotta say thanks to Craig and Layla because they did all of the brain work behind the modeling and have allowed me to share some of the information that they provided. at what different levels of modification would entail. So I'm just going to click through a couple of these slides, and then we can look at more in detail if you want. And Craig is here, Layla's online, so hopefully they can answer questions if they'll have it. So there were a couple of conclusions. You can read those yourself, but ultimately what I drew from that is that the salinity modeling is not as good as the surface elevation. So the salinity is harder to predict than the surface. There's also different scenarios and flow conditions. These aren't necessarily reflective of the exact inputs into the lake, but these are what we're used to model the different scenarios. So we're looking at the current elevation today of 4187, an elevation of 4190.5, and an elevation of 4192. And these all start on January 1st. So we're already past that date, but important information that this would be predictive of the next year starting January 1st.
Can we go full screen?
Oh, sure. Do you mind clicking
Sorry,
the messages there? No, that's good. Good call.
That's an 8-point font.
Yeah, sure.
These old guys.
All right. So this is probably the main guts of what folks would be interested in. So I'm not going to go through all of these and read them to you. You can take a look at these, but ultimately what this says is that under flows like we saw last year, there's a definite benefit to having the berm in place. But when we really realize the benefit of the berm is when we start to see those higher inflows, like the 2019 level flows of 0.3 million acre feet, or even a 2017 type year where we have 3.5 million acre feet, and then those benefits are even further realized as we get into like the 12, 24, 36 month time frame. So that's like I said, I'll email this out to everyone so you can see this and digest it at your own pace. But that is ultimately where we're at. I'll pull up a few more comparisons in a line graph that might help you to pick that a little bit better. So at 3.5 feet and 5 feet, here's the north arm elevation. And I know there's a lot going on there, so I'll kind of breeze through these. And again, I'll send out the appropriate slides here towards the end. And then I'm just going to go here to the south arm that has the same information at 3.5 and 5 feet. So again, as you can see, there's obviously some impacts to both the south and north, but at a certain point, you start spilling over the berm and then also coming in through the west culvert and refilling the north arm. So the difference in elevation, from what I could tell, doesn't get as extreme as what I think I would have initially guessed. But Craig, I don't know if you want to comment, or Layla online, about any of these predictions so far.
Well, if we knew the future, we could do a little better job.
Yeah. Working on that one, right? Tim, did you have an appropriation for that?
So, hopefully part of our study will help us with long-term predictions. But right now, we just don't know.
Yeah. And let's see, Jody, do you have a question?
Yeah. So is this just the opening at the north-south arm causeway, or the Union Pacific Causeway, or is this berms in other places in Gilbert Bay?
Just the berm that separates the north and south arm between the causeway there, where the opening was installed. In August, we raised that berm to 4187 and had some great impacts in the reduction of flow from north to south. But now, we've concluded that raising the berm above the surface elevation would help to slow those flows from north to south and south to north, and ultimately keep freshwater inflows in the south arm.
Thanks, Ben.
Sure.
Can you kind of walk me through like what the yellow, there's the dotted lines and the solid line?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not following all the logic here.
So the dotted line in yellow, we'll just use the yellow as an example. The dotted line is 2019. This is what it would be if we did nothing right now. The solid yellow line in 2019, and I should say the dashed line for the first one is the no change. The 2019 solid line is at 3.5 feet, and then the dotted line is the 2019 at 5 feet raised. So you can see the
5 foot raise in water elevation, or 5?
Yes, it was surface elevation, or excuse me,
In the
5
berm.
foot raise of the berm. So then that corresponds to the elevation here on the side. So, again, this is probably easier to read on this if you're really concerned about specific elevations and want to see that. That's more of just a good visual representation, so you can see those inverses on how that works out. So again, I'll send this out so you can digest it on your own time. It's a lot easier when you can dive into this and read that. But yeah, I'll leave this up here for the remainder of the discussion. I think that's probably the main point there. I know salinity is the main concern here that we're after, is stabilizing that salinity. And I don't think it's all that beneficial to try to explain how GSLM modeled the salinity, but I think it's fairly reliable to predict that holding fresh water in the south arm is going to reduce the salinity, and it's something that we can work on in the future to get some better modeling and figure out how to hone in on those numbers. I don't know, Craig, do you find value in showing what GSLM predicted?
Well, it might be valuable to show what the differences are in different scenarios.
I'll zoom over to this slide and you all can take a look at it. I personally didn't find a whole lot of value, but it might be because Layla and Craig hold the actual knowledge to be able to dissect it. So,
and we're going to be able to do a little better job. Apparently, I missed a meeting where I understand Christine and Sam explained some of the mystery salt is not a mystery anymore. So,
Not sure we've talked about that yet, but yes, we're working on that. Yeah, we are using finer temporal resolutions on simulations to use quite a bit difference between what we were doing before.
and so if we use that algorithm, you won't have to make those statements that put a little doubt on what our salinity estimates are.
okay. And it certainly isn't doubt. I know that this is the best we have. I think it just doesn't take into account that 100 billion tons. And so I'll hurry and go to that. So here are the salinity chart, and I apologize. There's a 4189 modification in there that is no longer on the table. But if you can explain perhaps what these numbers mean, Craig or Layla, that would be helpful, I think, for everyone.
Okay, I'll let Layla explain them because she actually did the work. Are you online, Layla? Or have you
Yes.
dropped off?
Yes, no, I'm here. So just give me 1 second. Okay. So we said that the initial conditions are 183 grams per liter for our south arm. And these are the percentage of salinity changes compared to the initial condition. So the minus values are how much the percentage that they're going to drop, or the positive values are the percentage that they're going to increase, basically. So as you look, when we have higher flows, like the green rows is the highest flows that we run the model for. The decrease of salinity in the south arm is highest in percentage, and the lowest flows are the 2021 inflow and the 800,000 acre feet inflow.
Percentage, relative percentage drop.
So Layla, so like on the south arm where you have negative 29 at 4192 after 12 months, that'd be a 29% reduction in the current salinity.
Compared to 183.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Compared to 183.
Yeah.
Yep.
So like at 56 months at negative 56%, you'd be at essentially 90 grams per liter after 36 months of 3 point.
You need a calculator for that.
Okay, sorry, not 50. Wasn't it a percent reduction based on the grams per liter?
Yeah, okay, so if you get 46% reduction.
56% reduction of the 183 grams per
Well,
liter.
56%, yeah.
So approximately cutting it in half.
Yeah, that's probably.
So the thing about this though is that it's not capturing the mystery salt. So these are probably a little bit elevated. So I don't think these should be completely relied upon. But what it does say is that it does have an impact. And I think at some point, if we were receiving, 3.5 million acre feet a year, at some point we'd want to maybe even lower the berm again because we might get to a point where the salinity's too or not high enough. So this is just to, I guess, depict that a bit.
So in general, the GSLIM underestimates the salinity in the south arm. So as Ben mentioned, this the effect we see is a little bit probably overestimated.
So Ben had a hand up.
Yeah, it just appears to me that when I'm looking across different elevations of the berm, that there isn't anything significant between 4187 to 4192 in terms of the relative impact. Am I misreading this?
No, Ben, I think those were some of the things that gave me a little bit of pause too, is that there's some issues in the way it's predicted. So I think this is something that needs to be worked out, and we need better information on modeling the salinity. So you can take this with a grain of salt.
With the big inflow, the berm elevation will be insignificant because you're going to have a lot more flow through there, and it would be decreasing the salinity regardless.
Yeah, and again, when you get back to the surface, a summary of the surface elevations, you can find those happy mediums where you start going through West Culvert and above the 4192 or 4190.5 level, and you'll start seeing the north arm begin to rise. And that's where I think, there's modeling the salinity is probably quite a bit more difficult when you start seeing those, those spillovers. But again, this is why I don't do modeling.
I mean, it's difficult to understand because the history definitely showed us that we had a decrease in salinity with these kind of inflows when we shut off the culverts.
But this
So
reinforces that, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, what you're saying, like on that salinity slide, if you go back, under 2017 inflows where we're getting, what I can't remember what the 3 million acre feet.
Mm-hmm.
I think the percentage of salinity change is going to be across the board. We're going to have a major reduction of salinity. I don't know that it's a 30% net reduction when you don't modify the berm. That doesn't make sense that it would be a big greater reduction than having the berm at 4192. But again, some inconsistencies with modeling.
It's interesting to see that there's no difference between 4187 and 4192, or virtually no difference. I'm having a hard time grasping that, given that the history was telling us it made a big difference.
Well, at the lower elevations, if the lake, with those lower flows, the lake continues to drop. And so you really don't have any difference in north to south flow.
Okay.
Or much in south to north flow.
And is that true at 2019 inflow? And
2019 would probably be a little different.
The north arm gets more saline during that time, as you can see under different berm elevations under the modeling. But it's, again, I don't know that we would want to rely on this modeling for the decision. I think it's one of the doing a simple salt balance.
Is this just a single year, Layla, or is this a period of years?
This is 3 years.
Oh, 12 months, 36. Okay.
Mhm.
So let's stick with the 36.
And it's and Layla, it's 3. So if we look at the 36 month, we're looking at 3 years of that particular inflow.
Exactly the same conditions continuing.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think this is one of those things where if you were to take the salt balance and the inflows and do some back the napkin calculations, you would reflect similar information to some, which would be a reduction in salinity and just general observations in the past that have supported this. So again, that's why I think that it's probably most important to, look at the surface elevation when we're trying to decide, how much fresh water would be kept in the south arm. But
Bill Johnson had his hand up.
Yeah, the only point I was going to raise is it also depends on how you mix in the model, right? If you assume instantaneous mixing of the inflow, then you're going to have a very different effect on salinity in the model than if you actually have a mixing process. And I'm not sure how it works in GSLIM.
Layla, do you know how that works with GSLIM?
Mixing of, can you say it again?
What I mean, Layla, is that if you take the inflow and immediately mix that into the lake in the model so that you reduce the salinity immediately and then start flowing out to the north arm, depending on the berm height, it's going to have, oh, sorry guys, a different effect on salinity.
Well, okay, so GSLIM is considering north arm as 1 point and south arm as 1 point. So you can see that it's just considering one value of elevation and salinity for the whole pool. And so
there's a lot of limitations to GSLIM I think we can recognize through this exercise. And predicting this is not necessarily what I think GSLIM is its strong point was with bisecting the lake. So this is, I think we have to take this with what it is, and perhaps this is an indicator that in the future we need to update GSLIM or recalibrate it or try to improve it to help model other scenarios. But what it does show is that it's likely that we'll hold additional fresh water in the south arm and meet some of our goals with salinity and raising the surface elevation. So I think that that's probably, I don't know that anybody would dispute that. But at this point, I think my recommendation, what we've been going off of, is that we would modify the berm. And as the elevation begins to rise, as runoff is coming through, we'd be working, with USGS and UGS and others that are monitoring to really hone in on the data and understand how that's affecting the south arm, and react as soon as we find that there's something different. We'll have a permit through the Corps through this process that's essentially a maintenance of our nationwide 3 permit that would allow us to go back at any time and modify this. And the railroad has been extremely cooperative, so I don't think it would be a problem. Halfway through runoff season, we decided that, like, whoa, man, salinity's really dropping. We need to go, breach this. We could potentially do that and react that way. So that's, yeah, Tom.
As I'm looking at this, when it's a foot of pit across that rock berm, I'm kind of okay. When you get out there on the far right-hand side where you've got a couple of feet or maybe even up to 4 feet difference between one side and the other, that berm is a lot like a French drain. You've got big rocks sitting there. You got gaps in between them. Mm-hmm. I think your berm will become less and less perfect the bigger head disturbance you have across that thing.
I agree, and I think that the bigger difference we see, as you can tell, like when you're looking at 2021 1.2 million acre foot inflows, I think that's one of the the larger differences there. And hopefully we don't get in a scenario like that where we continue to see nominal inflows. But the permeability of the berm, I don't see it being much different than the permeability of the causeway itself. If it is more permeable, that might indicate to us that we need to go in and do something to the berm itself to modify how the brines are flowing through it. But I think at that point, we're reacting to data that we've collected and trying to determine, the best way forward. But at this point, we do have to react fast because runoff season, as you heard earlier, it's come up 0.8 feet. So we've already missed an opportunity by not having it in now. If we continue to wait, we might continue to miss opportunities, and we certainly will start to miss even more opportunities by March when we really hit runoff. So the goal right now is to get this out on the street and get it bid out here in the next couple of weeks and get this modified in the next 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks tops.
On a different front, I mean, this is going to be a dam, essentially.
Yeah, there will be
holding back 700 square miles of open water. Is there engineering support to support, how this berm, because this berm is different than the one we constructed in July. That's just a speed bump. When you talk about cutting off flow from that sort of hydraulic head, constructing it, so it's as effective to meet the goals, but also the reopening. So if we, whenever we go back and reopen the thing, that could be an adventure.
Sure.
Cutting that a V-notch or a weir or shaving, a couple feet off. It seems like that really hasn't been considered here.
So the gentleman who engineered this had presented the first time around, and he engineers dams across the state. And so I have a high level of confidence that he's, considered these things, and we've had some discussions about that, but I don't believe there's a plan in place to go breach this. I mean, it was done by the railroad in 2017 without, any major.
They had different,
3 feet, I think.
pretty good difference.
So, and it wasn't like this, wave of this, standing wave came out, and it took, what, 2 years, I think, for it to equalize. So,
Is there a limit Causeway itself for what a differential can be?
probably that's, I think that, so we're discussing this with the railroad now to see if they have any concerns about this. I don't, when we did meet with them last week, and when I discussed this, I don't know that they fully absorbed that the head difference could be so extreme, but this is certainly something they will see as well as we're working with them.
The other thing is just the levels recede, that head difference doesn't have quite the same. If the water levels were higher, that head difference is a lot more impactful than at these low levels where you're getting awfully close to it starting to recede from the base of the berm, right?
And these are things that I think,
Causeway stuff.
The state will have to monitor, and I think we can react if we start to see adverse impacts. But this is something that, the railroad was interested in seeing, whether there were impacts we could.
It would be good though to have, an assessment, not adding time or that much complexity as to how it would be breached in the future, to make sure we're not constructing something that's unbreachable. This may be very skilled at building dams, but dams aren't typically breached in such a manner. So
I think that's a worthy question, and that's certainly something I could circle back with the engineer on. But there's a pad that's out there to get equipment out there. I really don't think that pulling through rocks out of there is going to be as eventful as it might seem.
Didn't we do that in 2017?
That was more or less what happened.
We dug a hole, it was full shot.
but that was the original Causeway. This is
No, there was actually they check dam in, there's a check dam in there. I mean, I think to Joe's point, I think it's, and I would imagine he as a professional engineer would want to document his assumptions for the record. But I think that, because this isn't a permanent dam. It's not being designed as a permanent dam. It's being designed to, as a tool to raise the water level, for it to be readily adjusted, based on changing conditions.
just as long as that's a component of it, that we don't.
And we're not
doing something that's unbreachable.
Right. And I think that's a good point we need to make sure it's clarified. I think, as I recall, when they put a berm in, so that they could build a bridge. And so then at the end, I remember the video, they had excavator on both sides, and it wasn't it was impressive. There was a lot of water. That clean water is a powerful thing. But it wasn't this. There were waves that went in between, but there wasn't damage when this happened. But I think that's something we can ask him and absolutely verify. I think one thing that struck me here is that, as you look at, even with this first year, in a great scenario, we have a great being lots of inflow, or we have 3.5 million of inflow. If at our current berm elevation, we'd see an increase to 4191.5. As you increase, we're looking at maybe 1.5 feet of increase in the first year. By the third year of those flows, the difference isn't significant there, because we're overflowing that berm. We're filling the north arm again. And I think if we look at the worst case, where we have even worse inflow than we did last year, what we see in the north arm and the south arm is, there's not a whole lot of change there in either arm in terms of water level. And even at 3 years, we're not seeing a whole lot of change there. The north arm staying at 41, 82.8, 82.5, 85.5, 85.6. So we're, so anyway, it's Thomas.
Doesn't the GSLM model take into account evaporation?
Yes, yeah.
It has the USGS method, which is basically a calibration.
So when the salinity gets a little high, like you would see at 4182, there's quite a bit of suppression of evaporation.
Explain how that works, because if you keep a pool of fresh water, and fresher water will evaporate more rapidly. Again, I'm the layperson here talking about this, but are you Joe? Yeah, this guy knows more about it. You know, there's a lot of horsepower in this room. I appreciate. But am I wrong in that thinking that if you contain all the fresh water in the south arm, that wouldn't that evaporate more rapidly than if that were released into the north arm and assimilate?
So the assumption is that the water that flows into the lake mixes pretty well, and so you wouldn't have like a fresh surface. You'd be pretty much just taking the amount of salt that you have. How it works is it takes the amount of salt you have in the lake and distributes that among with all the water that's there. You get a certain salinity, and you have a certain evaporation suppression from that. Now, we need eventually to have, when we get, many more millions of dollars of funding, maybe a hydrodynamic model of the lake that could tell you exactly what the surface salinity would be as opposed to the bottom of the lake. But right now, it just assumes it is it's kind of like a box where you mix the salt up and it's a single salinity.
And I think your assumption, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, if the south arm is fresher, the evaporation rate can be higher.
Yes.
But what we don't have is we have a smaller surface area. Where the water is.
And this should capture that. I believe GSL captures the difference in evaporation of different salinities, right?
Yes.
So this is reflective of that.
So there's the surface area.
Repeating.
Yeah,
things going on.
So there's more than just that salinity that's affecting the evaporation rate. There's that surface area.
93, I believe. Sorry, I just heard someone ask about the breach on the west culvert. I think it's 4193, if I remember correctly.
23.8 is what we have in the model.
Okay. You said 93.8.
Yeah.
That's about right. Just
Okay.
anecdotal observations on
From someone who knows nothing about the lake.
having driven over that bridge.
Good. Any other questions? So I think the intent of the berm, raising the berm, well, the intent of the berm, I don't think that's what the reason for it is, to try to capture the inflows to the lake in this year and coming years, to raise the water level and dilute the salts that are in the south arm. And if the lake goes above 4190.5 or 4192, it would overflow into the north arm. And I think the other intent is that we would continue to monitor the lake and observe what the changes are, and then revisit. This would be we would continue to revisit this question and decide whether we need to change that or not.
So I believe that, the salinity committee would be more important than ever, if we were to raise the berm, and begin monitoring and paying attention to those numbers, trying to forecast and decide, what the salinity levels are going to look like in different conditions. We would have to be really reviewing those numbers frequently and then making recommendations so we have time to react.
Jeff, it may be helpful just for some of the people that weren't here last time. Maybe they know, it goes without saying, why we're contemplating the recommendation at all. So what's at stake that would force us to act versus not act?
Yeah. And maybe, let me open so this as a good segue, I think, to the recommendations memo that I drafted. Let me get that on screen here, because that provides some of that ISIS.
Oh, sorry, I need to get my screen off there, thanks. And then I guess I need to actually unshare it. Sorry, multitasking is my strong suit.
Great. So I guess just a brief backstory on this. A year ago, December 2021, we were talking, the committee was talking about very similar concerns, that rising salinity of the lake, what can we do? There was concerns, and so the committee drafted, we came up with this memo that summarizes, what we were observing, what the concerns were, and then what the recommendations were. And so this was forwarded and sent specifically to the directors of the Division of Forestry, Fire and State Land, and the Division of Water Quality to act upon and for them to consider, I guess I should say. So what I did is basically I took the memorandum from last year, and I want to premise that this is draft. So this is just purely for discussion. We wanted to have something for us to redline and to be able to discuss as a committee. But what we're recognizing as a committee is that inflows to Great Salt Lake have been declining over the last 20 years and have resulted in an all-time record low lake level of 4188.5 on November 3rd, 2022. Great Salt Lake has been modified through construction of causeways and other structures and is subject to climate variability and uncertainty in chemical and ecological responses. The next point just speaks to the fact that there is an element of uncertainty in all the science that we're doing. But that does not preclude the ability to evaluate the system and make recommendations based on the best available science. The next bullet just recaps what we did last year. The committee recommended to the state that the flow control berm and the Causeway Bridge be modified to reduce the import of salt to the south arm from the north arm. The recommendation was made on the basis that measured salinity concentrations in the south arm had approached and exceeded the salinity range of 120 to 160 grams per liter identified by the committee as most protective of beneficial uses in the south arm. So as a result of that, the state of Utah raised the berm by 4 feet to an elevation of approximately 4187 through placement of new rock on top of the original berm. Subsequent monitoring of flow through the bridge has indicated that the modification of the berm was successful in reducing that north to south flow and import of salt to the south arm. So that's, I guess, the background there. I guess any questions or comments on that, or anything we should be adding to the background? I think then the next section is, the committee is concerned that the measured salinity concentrations in the shallow layer of the south arm have exceeded the salinity range identified by the committee as most protective of beneficial uses. The most recent measurement of salinity in the shallow layer of the south arm by the USGS was 187 grams per liter on November 22nd. And obviously that number, I think, as Christine mentioned, it fluctuates depending on where you are, but it's still at least in the 170 to 127 range. Salinity concentrations above that range are primary concerns to the health of brine flies, brine shrimp, and microbialites in the south arm. They represent the foundation of the south arm's food web, supporting migratory birds, recreation, and industry. The exact impact of their decline is unknown, but it could be consistent or significant. I guess I wanted to make sure I'm capturing the sentiments of the committee here. This is just based on the discussion that we've been having. The estimated salt mass of the south arm has been increasing steadily since 2018. The observed trajectory continues to increase and likely cause salinity concentrations to also continue to increase at low lake levels. The cause of the increasing trajectory of salt mass is not understood at this time, but the trajectory has been validated via independent analyses of independent data sets. So that's work that Phil Brown did with the data that he had, and then USGS repeated the analysis with their data sets. And that's an increase that we've been observing, we've been talking about ever since, trying to figure out where is this missing salt that's coming. We don't have a resolution on that, but I think we've been crossing things off our list. That's still being worked upon. Recent observations indicate that many microbialites in the South Arm have been exposed to the air by declining water levels and are desiccating, are being detrimentally impacted by wave action, and represent a loss of important habitat for brine flies. Submerged microbialites are now in a restrictive salinity zone with the resulting loss in productivity. Observed brine fly numbers have significantly declined along the lake shoreline, and current salinity concentrations are having a negative impact upon brine fly size, population numbers, and reproduction. So that's, from the discussion from David Earp's visit, I think in November here, there's a group of the committee met to talk about specifically looking at the brine flies. A continued decline of lake water levels will likely cause salinity concentrations in the South Arm to continue to increase above the protective salinity range. And so then in terms of the recommendations, what we talked about last month was, again, this is draft. This recommends that adaptive action be taken to reduce or stop the increasing trajectory of salinity in the South Arm while lake levels are low, below 4192. I think we talked about, if we don't want to, if the lake comes up, that can also have a detrimental effect for the salinity of concentrations can go too low. The committee advises that need is urgent and that planning and permitting should begin immediately. Action should be taken as soon as practical with consideration of lake dynamics. Recommendations include adaptive action, should include modification of the berm at the new bridge, modifications, that is raising the top of elevation of the berm, should temporarily disconnect the North Arm from the South Arm to artificially impound all surface water inflows to Great Salt Lake in the South Arm. The intent is for the captured and added volume of water in the South Arm to artificially raise the South Arm water level higher and dilute the salinity more than if inflows were also contributing to the North Arm. Disconnecting the North Arm from the South Arm also effectively reduces the surface area of Great Salt Lake. This has the added benefit of reducing the evaporative loss of inflows to the lake. This is the most feasible adaptive management tool available. That said, it's recognized that disconnecting the North Arm from the South Arm could reduce water levels in the North Arm and potentially influence operations of Compass Minerals. The state should work closely with Compass Minerals to better understand potential impacts to their operation, identify any operational flexibility they may have, and identify opportunities to mitigate potential impacts to their operation. The state of Utah should investigate seasonal modification of the flow control berm such that water from the South Arm can be exported to the North Arm when salinities in the South Arm are highest. Exporting salt to the North Arm from the South Arm could further reduce the increasing trajectory of salinity in the South Arm. That's something we talked about at our last meeting. Berm modifications should be temporary while the committee develops long-term solutions. I think that's a key element here. This is not a permanent change. The intent is for this to be temporary. Modifications should be adaptively managed and coupled with intensive monitoring of flow through the bridge and changes in Great Salt Lake salinity. And then funding should be provided to advance the committee's research framework, including modeling to better understand the lake dynamics and develop long-term adaptive salinity management plan. Further work is needed to reduce uncertainty and make better informed decisions. And I think that was a key part of our charter, was to identify research that is needed. And so we originally developed one research plan that we made significant progress on this last year. We've been working on updating that research plan. And then the Salinity Committee should regularly review lake conditions and update its management recommendations toward protective salinity concentrations in the South Arm. So the intent is to make a change, monitor it, and then adaptively manage or make additional changes to that berm as needed. So any comments, or I know committee members got a draft of this, so if you have, I guess, what I'd like to work toward is work towards consensus around this memo, so that's something that, because I think it's important for the state to get recommendation. It is, I guess, our charter as a committee is to provide the state with recommendation. So yeah.
And these are all in good faith, appreciating that we have a significant problem on the way. I think we need to be very organized and focused on what the objective is for the berm. We talked about this a bit in the last meeting. The initial berm, the 87, was to prevent north to south flow, and it achieved most of the objectives. It's been successful. The objective for this was, as focused on last meeting, was to contain inflows into the South Arm to affect a better dilution. There's a concern that there may be a bypass that occurs in Bear River flows that disconnects and goes into the South Arm. I think we need to be very organized on what the objective is. So that's one objective, and I understand that. Compass Minerals understands the need to affect a better dilution to see if we can really positively impact the salinity of the South Arm. I think we start going down a slippery slope when we start talking about, obviously, a knock-on effect from containing South Arm, containing the inflows in the South Arm, is you're going to have an increase in lake elevation. When we start talking about the benefits of increasing lake elevation outside of arresting the salinity, we start adding on additional objectives. We've crossed the red line with 16%, 160. US EPA or DEQ's doing the work towards an impaired or threatened status because of that, because of the brine shrimp, the loss of aquatic functions and values. Not saying that having an increased area, of wetted area in the South Arm, doesn't have knock-on benefits, the microbial lakes, but that is not that is more subjective than we've crossed the 1,660 milligrams per liter threshold. And I think we need to be very cautious on what the objective is here. We say temporary, and I very much appreciate the sentiment behind temporary. That's a slippery slope if you don't have very clear objectives. Where are kind of walk down milestones from 18.7 to 16? Where kind of this very significant and unprecedented action, closing off a part of a jurisdictional, federally regulated waterway, is a very significant action. To establish what those criteria are, what those triggers are for the reconnection is very important. And, in other contexts, we wouldn't be able to get away without having sort of measurable thresholds for various criteria. Outside of the DEQ US EPA dynamic, I think we do have the horsepower to identify what those step down concentrations are, and quickly. That said, temporary, the notion of temporary at a 4192 elevation would reasonably take multiple years, of average to above average inflow to overcome. In a federal, so if you were doing a 401, 404 permit, a new one, if you were claiming to make temporary impacts, you could not exceed a one year impact under a letter of intent without triggering a new process. So to keep it temporary and keep the intent of the committee, I think we need to establish a reasonable elevation of the berm that would, it feels like there might be a 2-foot increase, in the offing with the snowpack that we have. A 4190 elevation of the berm would largely achieve the goal of retaining the inflows into the south arm, affecting a better dilution. We've talked about 90 or 90.5, but it's all towards keeping it temporary. And if we're in a position in the future where there needs to be additional layering, I think we're back in the same boat, like that would need to happen. But let's keep this. This is a 2023 problem that we're trying to arrest and trying to get in place as quickly as possible before the inflows start coming in. So let's right size this thing to a 23 solution. And that said, we really, Compass Minerals would really needs the state support because of this relatively unprecedented action of closing off half the waterway and ceasing flow to it by design, that we have as mitigation for that recognition from the Corps of Engineers and DEQ that we can extend our intake canal, our lifeline, to the north arm, not to improve hydraulics, not to ramp up, production, but to just stay status quo. We normally, by design, would operate 10 pumps. We're at 0. In August, they were 0. Okay, and that's partly because of the berm that was constructed. If we're completely closing off flow and arresting, inflows that would reasonably happen during this upcoming water year, we really need the state to support us to be able to extend our intake canals as part of the recognition of authorization or approval from the Corps of Engineers for us to be able to do that. And again, not to ramp up hydraulics or capacity, just to stay connected. And that would be mitigation and a connected action as a result of this. It's not an unreasonable request.
What's that canal, Joe, just to be clear? Which that intake canal you're talking about, the location?
It's in the north arm. It's in the north arm. And that's just to keep our west ponds connected. And again, this isn't a regrade or revamping the entire system. This is just to stay maybe at that 2 pumps, just to stay active. It was identified that the lake's already come up, half a foot, in the south arm, and we want to try to get ahead of the water here. We understand that. But is there not kind of a snowpack trigger, that could be considered as to maybe, if it only takes, no more than a week to construct because all the infrastructure is already out there. Is there possibility of waiting until, end of February to have a look at what the snowpack is doing?
That's the likely timeline anyway. It's a week to construct, but there's a lot of, planning and coordination with the railroad and everything between now and.
So thank you, man. So to stay on track with this temporary status that we, I think we all can get around that, or, get behind that. We think establishing a more reasonable elevation that achieves the objective without making this a multiple water year, potential design, is a reasonable ask, while largely achieving the objectives.
So Joe, I'm not as familiar with your application, so are you having difficulty getting approval for extending your canals in the north arm? I mean, that's probably a dumb question, but it sounds like you probably are. And how far would you want to extend them, and what elevation would you like to be at? And I don't personally, I wouldn't see how that, now that the Causeway culverts are closed, after a certain elevation, you're kind of disconnected from the south arm. So I'm not sure.
We have no connection to the south arm.
Well, okay. So if you If the lake's low, I mean, if the lake's high enough and you get enough water, it's okay. You wouldn't need to extend your canals.
What I'm saying is by zeroing out inflow into the north arm, we can expect a 2-foot loss
Oh, yeah.
in 2023 evaporation.
I don't see what the problem would be with extending.
So we don't want to start a new process.
Oh, okay.
For that. This would be required. It wouldn't be required, but for this action. Okay, so but for is important, from a federal standpoint. And let's go back to 2014, 13, 14, when this was being permitted, and we're all in the same room for the most part. It would have been really easy for the UP just to close the culverts and not have mitigation. The mitigation was the bridge, so as not to impact or lose the functions and values of the north part of the lake. As nominal, arguably, as they are, with it being, near saturation. There is some, functions and values as part of a federally jurisdictional water body. So that was required. Taking the flow to zero, from my recollection, and I took a lot of parts of the permits out and sort of highlighted it. It was never necessarily contemplated to zero out the flow. It was just to sort of right size the flow from what was being lost in the closure of the culverts and designing a bridge to roughly replicate that. We understand we're in an unprecedented situation here, and we want to cooperate. We're just asking for a more reasonable elevation that aligns with the temporary premise. And if we're back at the same point next January, where we need to look at, either possibly increasing the berm, then, we would be in the same position. But I think the state would be well poised to be able to execute, whatever changes need to happen in the future. But let's not build this thing beyond what would other reasonably be conceived as temporary.
One question I have that you might have done, John.
Yeah, I'm done.
But one of the questions I have is, do we have a sense, right now we're dealing with the best available data, but do we have a sense of what that elevation is that would be most protective of salinity? Because if that's really the key, right, we're trying to find it, and we have to have a little bit of a, for lack of a better word, a safety cushion, right? Because if next summer deals us a bad enough hand, then what you don't want to do is just hit 20, right? 20 parts for, 20% salt, right? And really just crash that entire ecosystem, right? Because you cut it too fine. Does that make sense? But do we have a sense of, because I honestly don't, and I'm not an expert to be able to say, but as between these proposed elevations, which one is more or less protective of what we're trying to do, which is protect the ecosystem?
So, by building it taller, you protect against, potential section. Okay, so a reverse flow that may introduce north arm brine. But we're talking a handful of events tops, like a 2 or 3, 1 day long periods. That would be, my understanding of a risk. So if you have 3 days, out of a year where you have a session, it's a de minimis volume of salt. The concern of overbuilding this thing is you then start to bleed in other objectives, the increase of surface layout area. I'm not saying they're not worthwhile potentially for considerations, but we are talking about this emergency, unprecedented action to arrest salinity. So keeping it in those bounds, and building this berm to continue inflow, all the inflow in the south arm to have a longer duration mixing period, achieves that. But let's right size that elevation.
So Joe, just summarize what I heard you say is that the objective is clear, that we want to dilute, we want to capture the inflows, and also we want to dilute the slump. But it's not clear. We don't really have sideboards on that. Here's an objective for what we're trying to do, but we don't say this is what we're not trying to do. Right? So we haven't really put a limit on that.
Yeah, if our singular objective is to arrest and improve salinity, I'm saying we should be very focused on that. And the ancillary impact, and if you contain more water in the South Arms, yeah, the elevation is going to come up as a result of that action. But to have that slip in as an objective it's a second objective, and it could be more of an impediment in the future to change the berm. You're adding an objective. Yeah. So let's just I'm suggesting we stay disciplined on what that.
You know, I think obviously the objective is the salinity, but then there's the secondary benefit that we have more surface area and higher surface elevation on the south arm. But the only thing that I think is, so I guess a couple questions. At what elevation, or when did you say you had to shut off your pumps for your west pond already? That was in August?
It was in August, yeah.
So I guess two things. The connected action, I mean, hasn't that already occurred where you have to extend your intake now?
We would reasonably expect inflow from this coming water year.
Okay.
To come back. So we lost
value like this evaporation season.
Yeah. So we lost, a month, give or take, of pumping this season, but you would expect, the inflow to come back in.
And then by next year, you might not have.
We might be in the same spot.
And then the other question I had was, or comment, I guess, is that, if we were to say we wanted to model it to get it to 160 grams per liter, if that was the threshold, and we were able to intelligently say 4190 point whatever it is does that, that's going off of, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know that we have the horsepower to say that, because we're not, I mean, you saw the salinity calculation. So if we said 40, that was our target, we were getting just to the bare minimum to be within that healthy range, but we don't have the full story, then we're perhaps missing out on an opportunity where if we said 4192, brought it up, and maybe it goes down to 145 grams per liter, and we say, all right, we hit that, now let's let a little water to the north arm, let's go take some boulders out. I mean, that's an opportunity, and I understand that that's not as easy, it's not as easy said as it is done. It's just, if we spill a bunch of water over and we didn't quite get to the threshold we were aiming for, that would be a huge miss for us. Like, we have a 3.5 million acre foot year, and we can't capture that, and then we hang out at 165 grams per liter, and then have a dud of the inflow year the following year.
But outside of a 2 foot gain in the south arm, it becomes you would have affected the dilution in the south arm during that time, and if there were a banner year, and I pray that happens, a 3 foot increase, then okay, it's doing its natural function of flowing into the severed part of the lake.
Yeah, Tom.
When you get a minute, I've just got 5 quick points here. Number one is this is a state-owned piece of ground. It's been managed by the legislature for a number of years. There's 10 objectives that the state is required to manage. 4 of them have to do with encouraging mineral extraction. I'm in complete support of most of what Joe said here, maybe all of it. If you're going to shut these guys off, that's a taking to some degree. And I think the state's got to recognize that situation, because this is managed. It's an artificial lake that's been managed for a number of years, and when you're making choices like this, I think it puts Compass in a really bad position. I think any plan you've got's got to look for support for Compass's position. I just strongly feel that overall the state management of this lake is directed, almost half of its objectives are to support mineral extraction.
Do you agree with the point that's in the memo then?
Yeah.
That says that.
And then 1963, the lake was saturated. Saturated for about a year, maybe a year and a half. It didn't die. It was saturated. It came back. It was probably not good for brine shrimp, and the bird may have to fly somewhere else. But this is not completely unprecedented. The reason it's not saturated right now is we've sequestered a lot of salt in the North Arm, and mineral extraction added millions of tons of salts to their floor. So I think that we want to be careful here, and I think Joe's exactly right. You ought to have some parameter to understand what's enough. And if you have to go back and do it another year sometime later, that's fine too. And lastly, I was a little concerned just in general, this is a public meeting, right? We don't post it on the Utah Public Notice website like we're supposed to. I couldn't find it.
I could find it for you after the meeting if you'd like.
Okay, because I looked yesterday, I couldn't come up.
I checked and it's there.
What department is it under?
It's under, Chris, do you know what,
It's
under our division?
Forestry, fire, and state.
And then under the advisory.
It's under natural resources. You got a separate subgroup, so I'd find that way.
I'll show you after if you'd like.
Okay. I think that's all I'm just saying. I think Joe's made a lot of good points here that they need to be listened to.
If I could bring up one more point. So understanding time is of the essence, fully appreciating that, Ben. We made a significant change in July by constructing the Salinity berm, the one that's in the ground now. We really haven't allowed sufficient time to assess whether or not that's been effective on the south arm. It seems like there's a fairly wide range of salinities measured in the south arm. We understand that this action is reasonable, arguably, as long as it's right sized. To right size this berm and keep this a 2023 water year solution will give us time to understand, without changing all the variables of it at once or too close to one another to really see, what the incremental benefits were is another thing, just staying disciplined, on this is a 23 water year issue, matter, and just keeping it contained and appreciating that we really haven't given all of our water quality monitoring locations in the South Arm sufficient time, even with the last action, to assess success or not.
Okay, Bill, sorry, go ahead. Bill Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. I think these are great points. And I guess what this brings to mind is the question, is the action to raise the berm based solely on salinity objectives, or does it also concern water level objectives and area of the lake? And that has to be very clearly laid out, because otherwise, yeah, you will end up in a muddle in terms of when do you call this complete?
Successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, so that's kind of, I wrote down sideboards on the objectives. To make sure that that we're contained and clear as to what we're trying to do. And the second item you brought up was just triggers to, what's going to trigger a change in the berm. Is it going to be that we get to the water level, or is it going to be because we got to the salinity and we look at the model of salinity based on growth, what kinds of changes we're going to have. So I think that's something that I think relates back to the triggers that we're using to recommend action, which is we want to get down to that 160, that 16% salinity. And then the last item that you mentioned is just the right sizing it. What do we need for 2023? And I think if we look at the water levels from the modeling, just even the 12-month range, how much of a difference does that 90.5 versus 90 to, can we build it to 90.5 now? And then, if it's, and observe how that changes and go back and build it to 92. I guess to your point, is if we get a banner year, we would probably miss a bunch of that water. And would that get us down to 16% or not? I guess that's the unknown. We're not sure.
I, for one, am very happy that you mentioned your concerns. We're at a point where we need to, we have limited staff. We need to figure out what are the parameters we're going to be modeling. And so that we were asked the question today, well, okay, what are the things that we should be looking at? And that's a question that, this group will help us answer. And hopefully we can get some clarity on that sometime in the near future.
To that point, I was on that call with Craig where I think there was a discussion about what questions should be modeled. And right now, I think they're doing their level best to try to model everybody's questions, and these questions are coming in from all different things. But where the focus right now is on salinity, I think it makes sense for this group to play a role in in shaping those questions and prioritizing those questions so that Craig's shop doesn't have to chase all over the place. I will say that to some of your points and to what you were saying, man, I think the write-up, the way you've done it, focuses on salinity. I don't see those extraneous things running in there, and that's, of course, what this group does. Now, of course, if I had it my way, I'd strengthen the downside risk end of things, right? Because that's the one thing, giving it short shrift is really a significant risk. Because what are we worried about? Really seriously, what are we worried about? Well, we're worried about the ecosystem in the 60s. It may have gone off a cliff, right? But nobody was really there to sort of pay attention and, maybe the birds had other places to fly that they don't have now. But I think that concern is whatever that, we didn't quite hit it. We picked some bad stuff this summer. We really go off a cliff. It's not like you couldn't find brine flies. You still had brine shrimp. But if you hit 3% salinity, you may have none of those things. And if you shorted it or you delayed too long and you missed the inflow and then everything shuts off and we get a super hot summer, then guess what? ESA listings, here we come. And all those policymakers up there are going to be a little bit upset that we had an opportunity to mitigate and we didn't get it. So that I only say that just a little bit of a counterweight, Joe, which is I totally get you. We need to know what those triggers are on the back end. We don't need to own other people's agendas. We need to be able to reverse it. If it's truly temporary, let's do it. It needs to be right sized, 100%. But boy, we better err on the side of caution because I'd hate to go to all this. I'd hate to go to all this work and then next summer we hit 2021 because the implications, not just for the people in this room, but for the people outside of this room, are.
We've had in the past 2 years a 0.5 and 0.7 foot increase in lake elevation, respectively.
Yeah.
Okay. This 41, 90, 90.5 gives you a 2 foot delta. You're containing 2 feet of inflow, isolating that to the south arm. Okay. Anything else above that is gravy for the system. Is really how, on average over decades, it's about a 2 foot rise, 2 foot fall. Roughly average.
Give or take, right?
Yeah, ballpark. So if what I heard in the last meeting that every foot of elevation gain, the lake as it is today, gives you a 0.5% salinity decrease. Okay, a 2 foot process will get you a 17 handle.
But Joe, it's a 1 foot compared to where we are today. We're at 174. So you add a foot, that brings you down 170. Salinity is at 174 ppt right now. So you
on average or
no, it is right now. The salinity is at 174 ppt.
That's one of the problems is we're talking about a lot of different data points. And, I've heard even today between 16 and 18.
Well, we're looking between 1 and 3 meters depth. We're not doing surface salinity, which is very variable, especially today. So, at that, the depth of 3 feet, 174. And you're proposing, and the lake elevation right now is at 4189. If you're proposing to go to 4190, that's an additional foot. That would bring the salinity down by 0.5 percentage point, which would put it at 170 ppt, parts per thousand, 17%, which is still significantly above those targeted numbers between 12 and 16. So maybe it's a little bit higher than that.
Well, and I think there's room to talk about. Is there what is that ideal?
Yeah, you want to ground it in something.
But 4192 is overshooting, and I'm 100% convinced it's overshooting a 23 water year, a reasonable 23 water year objective. So is that a 90.5? A 90.5 would get you that 2 foot from where the south arm began at 88.5, as shown here. We've already realized some gain. A good snowpack shaping up.
So it would be a 4191 just to get you down to 16, 4191 and a half. I'm doing that in my head too quickly.
Where were we last winter?
The other thing, though, is there's going to be a new paradigm. If we have this berm, right, and all the water is contained in the south arm, it's not unreasonable to think you're going to get more of a boost, a benefit for salinity in the south by being able to contain it. So that rate of improvement or reduction may actually accelerate by doing this. So, we've spoken, Ben and I, at length over the past weeks. A 90.5 is workable and keeps it in that temporary status, from what a reasonable water year would bring. Yeah, there might be some spillover if we have a bang up year, and we should all be happy.
Right? I'm just brainstorming it. Is there something on the flip side where, as I'm hearing you suggest, is that, that we build it to 90.5 now and then evaluate what we need to do. If it doesn't work, then, or if we need to do more, then we do more. We consider what our options are. If we were to do 4192 now and and then evaluate what compare the results to the modeling and what the effect is on the north arm. Then what we can then explore, well, what are the options there to help you with the canal to mitigate those impacts after this first year.
A 92 is outside of what at least the Corps of Engineers has historically put guardrails on as temporary. Okay, so within a 1 year time frame.
So last meeting, we talked about maybe going back in the summer when salinity peaks and exporting salt to the north arm. So does that mean a requirement of temporality? Because if we go back in July or August and modify the berm again and export salt based on what we saw in 2016, that we can do that, does that, because now we're making a change. And so can we hedge the bet and do a little bit of both? Make sure that we get the berm high enough now to capture every bit of runoff that we can. And because we don't know what this impact's going to do. I mean, it's raining today for January. Shouldn't be raining in January.
Can take it.
I know we'll take it. I mean, nobody's complaining, but it should be snow, right? And so it's one of those where if we raise the berm high enough, yeah, there's going to be that issue of what's too high from a temporality standpoint. But if we go back in 6 months later and then drop that down the next fall, you know what I mean? There's a different side to temporary.
So Kyle, to Tim's point, I mean, we're also, you're looking at averages. Right. The last couple of years, we've had relatively no inflow. Several years before that, we were at 2.2, and before that at 3 million acre feet. And so at the end of the day, you're looking at these average inflows, and sometimes you have to capture the large inflows in order to make up for, the evaporation when there's very little inflow. And I think that was the point Tim was making.
Capture everything you can.
Yeah, I think if I understand what Carl's saying, isn't it temporary if we conceivably try to catch a bunch in the spring and then release some in the summer to export salt.
Making our application.
That's what you said,
right? That's the question I'm asking.
But one of the thoughts we've had is that there might be an elevation, and that would require some additional modeling. That would be sort of an intermediate elevation where if you go above that, you are exporting salt and exporting water. And if you're below that, you're capturing everything. And again, it's probably too early for us to decide what that elevation is, but I think that's what the historic numbers were showing us. And
the 90.5 elevation, it's still achieving a significant benefit that the lake isn't enjoying today in this unprecedented period. That's and we're talking about an unprecedented action that wouldn't have been allowed 6 years ago, 7 years ago when UP permitted the bridge of severing half of a federally jurisdictional water body. So The concern at 92 is you're outside of the temporary status, okay? But people get comfortable with that and the other ancillary benefits outside of the purview of the Salinity Advisory Committee. And it becomes very difficult to remove, and it transcends what this committee recommends.
Well, I think
There's a danger in that, and it becomes kind of the stalking horse to some degree.
I agree with that concern. I think it's important to, we need to make sure it's clear that the goal is that we want to improve the salinity of the South Arm. And we need to make sure it's clear that once we've achieved that, and I mean, that this is a short-term management action. You know, we need to have a long-term management plan for how we're going to get to the lake to address this concern. And
with a 23 solution, this provides the time in order to continually improve the science.
Right, and I think that the concern is that if we do 4190, or if we do 90.5 versus 92, that 90.5 might not be enough to avert a crash in 2023. We don't know for sure. And so can we go to 92 to provide us with better assurance that will protect the ecosystem and be able to evaluate what the response is, and then reevaluate next summer, and we'll continue, as we go, observe how the salinity and the water level is changing. We'll get better confidence in our model and be able to make a decision next summer. That, I think, I also hear a big significant concern of yours is we don't want mission creep. We don't want temporary to not become permanent. And how can we make sure that it is temporary and that there is an off ramp for this? It's not going to become a permanent fixture.
And opening the berm periodically under this situation is definitely something Compass is supportive of and would really drive for. But even that it's not even really a thesis yet. And there's concern, but what will happen, the way it's written now is it's going to 4192. Then we figure everything out later. Look, putting guardrails on it, having this be a reasonable 23 water year solution while we do the good work, of improving the science. I think is not an unreasonable position.
Another factor too is that if we had to go in and take rock off this year, we went to 4192 and we had to go in and say, peel some rock off to send some water to the south arm, whether it hit the 4192 level or send some water to the north arm. It's a lot easier to move rock when it's there and place it in the general area, which we've done when we modified the berm the first time. We basically, used rock from where the equipment sat and constructed the berm and then replaced that rock. But it would be a lot easier, if we did have to send some water to the north arm to move that rock rather than to mobilize, work with Union Pacific, find the rock again, probably from their quarry. I don't think they're going to give us rock and let us use their trains every single time we want to do this, especially if it becomes to the point where we're doing this every, 6 months or something. But if we had to, go out with a traco with a long arm and a few rocks, it would be doable.
I mean, you have the dynamic with UP. We have different relationship with them. But I mean, you indicated an hour ago how good they've been to work with. And this isn't going to be doesn't feel like it's going to be a forever thing. This is just a temporal thing. As praying the hydrology comes back and we start getting kind of snapping back to the norm. But indicating that it's difficult. It's difficult for Compass Minerals. I'm telling you that. I can't tell you how difficult and how material, a long-term change would be. And again, it's not unreasonable to keep this emergency situation to parameters of a 2023 water year, and let's use the time and resources we have between now and next water year. Understand?
I know, Joe, that you've said that elevation, maybe just sort of a side benefit and that we shouldn't be looking at that. But if we look at the inflows that we've had in the last 5 years or the last 10 years, on average, they're very similar. We still have a significant reduction of lake levels. At some point, those levels are going to be so low that maybe that water won't be available to compass minerals and or to magnesium core. Did I say that right? So, I mean, I do think that lake elevations matter. They matter to your operations, they matter to Tom's operations.
I'm not saying that they don't matter, but that's outside of the reason we're considering this unprecedented action is to arrest salinity by having scope creep and talk about, you know, those are real things, but it's outside of the purview of this committee, and in-depth assessments need to be done, you know, relative to stromatolites, bioharm communities, you know, air quality, dust, and whatnot. Those are, there's a separate set of science that's behind that. We're looking at very specific science, salinity, you know, and the effects on brine shrimp. It's creeping outside of that realm is dangerous, and you begin to strengthen those other concerns behind keeping a berm solution that we call temporary more permanent.
So I know in consideration of the time that we're at, I mean, I think this is important. I guess I would offer up a couple of options. One is, you know, we look at the language of this. Can we make it more specific in terms of the objective? Some triggers that would make it more definitive that it is temporary. You know, I guess, you know, make some edits to this document so that it does address your concerns. I think the other, I guess, you know, I know in terms of what the state's been trying to do is time is of the essence. They need to get the permit in place to be able to, well, I guess you don't need a permit. You need to move things forward to
information that it's within the permit
to try to take advantage of the incoming inflows that are coming this year. And so, you know, right now, I think, you know, I don't think it wasn't by accident that I left that 4192 yellow. But I guess what I'd like to try to do is move this forward so that the state can see, you know, get recommendations as to what do you think we should do as a committee. And so I want to try to see if we can, you know, find consensus around the memo and, you know, to be able to try to move forward. And so I don't, you know, is it something that you could provide some red lines on to help clarify it? And see if they need to vote as a committee soon.
Yeah, I mean, there's no more important project I'm working on than this. So, you know, we can provide immediate, you know, sort of feedback.
And then, or I guess, Chair Jim's still on. And what would be most helpful for the state?
It doesn't seem to me like unless we want to take a vote now or try to edit it this moment, but we're already 15 minutes beyond the meeting time. So I would support, you know, try to get a memo that's drafted that hears everyone's voice, get some consensus. But
and I think it's, I mean, I think in our chart, well, I know in our charter, it also says that, you know, we want to make sure all the different voices are heard. And so I think, you know, we would want to be able to, you know, forward, you know, if the memo, I guess, the consensus of the group or the other group is to, you know, to move it beyond 4190.5. But I think it's, you know, to make sure that your concerns are included with that. Well,
important too. I don't want to belabor it. I think the only asterisk I'd put on what Joe says, and I actually agree with what he says in terms of issue creep and other variables and all that makes a lot of sense to me. What I don't know, sitting here, I don't know if you here does know, is what elevation for the berm height is the most protective of the salinity. In other words, most protective of the objectives that we're trying to reach, whether that's 4190.5 or 4192. I just don't know what it is. And I think that ultimately should be the driver. So to the extent we can get refinement on that, that's what we'd like. And to the extent we can't get refinement on that, I sure as heck hope that we are on the side caution, understanding everything you're saying, Joe, understanding 100%. I just don't want to undershoot it and,
Understanding the limitations on GSLM, right? We all get it. But there was de minimis impact or your delta between a 95 and 92 as modeled by GSLM. So, I mean, 41, you could argue 4200 is the most protected.
but I will say our best proxy that wasn't modeled was when the breach was shut, because then we had real world data on what happened with salinity. We really were able to see it, and that does, right? There was pretty significant based on having that breach closed. So we have that, how was it, 3 years? What did we have? 3-year trial, basically to see what salinity did, and even see what elevations did as between the two on.
Well, let's, I guess, Joe, if you could send me some red lines on it. I guess if anybody has any red lines that you'd like to send to me, I will pull those together. I guess, could you get me something by tomorrow or Wednesday, and then I can, if everybody can do that, then I can pull that together and get that back out to the committee, and then I think we can go towards, and see what the comments are. I think maybe we can have a working call, just talk through what those comments are, and then get to the point where we can vote on the memo. Any of the other committee members have anything else on that?
Sorry, can I just ask a final question? If we're doing it to a salinity threshold, I'm just curious about, there's a 20 to 30 gram per liter fluctuation within a given year. So is it to the high end of that or to the low end of that? That's something to consider. And also what the GSLM model outputs are. What is that salinity change? Is it modeled to an average annual condition? Is it a higher end, low of that? I think that's an important detail to consider.
It will model to an endpoint and tell you what those conditions are, or you can do it by day. It doesn't really matter. If you want an average, you could probably get that as well. So it's whatever you need.
Just thinking about, do we want the south arm to be below 160 gram per liter for the entire year, or a certain part of the year? What's beneficial to the bio? That's something to consider.
Well, I think we want to definitely move it the other direction than it's been headed. We're seeing some reduction now, but I think we want to make sure it doesn't. We want to try to prevent it from getting up this high.
So Craig and Lily, are you able to model this to give us that, ideal elevation and what that target be, or is that?
With what degree of certainty? If you're looking for the results of salinity, I would like to have the additional capabilities of this algorithm that's being developed at Utah State. And then, I'm hoping we can get that in the month. But, we've not done that before, so I'll give you a conditional yes. But there's a bunch of things behind that we need to do. We need to have a model that accurately predicts salinity as we measure it in the lab.
But maybe, and Craig, maybe, I think so salinity is a challenge to model. But if we were to look at what's the elevation of the berm that where we can maintain the water levels or improve the water levels that we're at right now, any improvement in water level should reduce the salinity. But if the year after year we have another 1 million acre feet going this year, that would mean the lake is going to keep dropping and the salinity is going to keep going up. But if we have a million acre feet, how high is that going to go? And I think it would be helpful if we could send that table out to you, better understand.
Send it to you, you can distribute it.
Changes are. So
Could we have the data also from the period when the Causeway was shut to understand what the south side facility?
I think you posted that on, didn't you?
Does anybody know who supports that?
Send it again.
we'll find it.
I mean, because, the complexities of modeling are what they are. It's, we spend years doing this, but I mean, kind of linking it to historical data from that period. It may be very-
USGS had several presentations with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also the Great Salt Lake Hydromapper website, you can there's an interactive plot of salinity and lake elevation. Salinity measured at GSL 3510 or Saltaire, and so you can change the time period on there, and both those parameters will change at the same time, so you can visualize that.
Appreciating that, but I mean, there's not even really consensus on what is it Thomas's monitoring elevation in the water column or USGS? What would we be looking at as kind of the benchmark?
Jeff posted your data. Didn't you supply your presentation to Jeff? I think you put it on the website. Can't remember if Forest Garden State Lands.
We sent it out.
Or you sent it out? Yeah. And that would give you a sense of it. And I think USGS reviewed that using their independent data, and they were, relatively close.
I think so. I'll find the salt mass trajectory presentation to answer that question. I think Ryan and Christine, if you could find your information on showing how the salinity changed during the culvert closure period. I remember you had a graph that had that on. I think that would be helpful. We'll get the data out that came from the modeling that's just been done on those two different Berm options. So we have that information. And if the committee members, if you could send me your comments on the memo here by the close of Wednesday, I'll get that turned around to you all, so we can see what our options are there, to try to get consensus there. But I think, time is of the essence in trying to take advantage of our runoff this year. But obviously this is a very important decision. So, sorry we went way over here today, but I think the discussion is very important. And I think it's a good step forward to try to get to a resolution. Any other, any questions on our next steps? Anybody online have any other, or anybody else have any comments or?
Yeah, this is Jack Ray. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Jeff. Do non-members of the advisory committee have an opportunity to submit comments to you?
Sure. Yeah. Jeff, you have something now, that'd be great.
I can put it down in writing and send it to you. My only concern is if the berm is only raised to 4190.5, it doesn't seem as though you're leaving really any margin for error. And if current trends continue and we have additional dry years, then you're going to be behind the 8 ball again. And at the current salinity levels, if you're not factoring in some margin for safety, then we'll be facing this potentially catastrophic situation again.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Yeah, please send those to me and I'll forward them on to the committee.
Thank you.
Include those in the notes. All right, well, I guess motion to.
One other just quick thing, I just wanted to let everybody know that the Hot Topic grants, we're hoping to get some research topics here by January 20th. We've been letting the tech team know, but if you have any ideas for research needs, I think this committee is well suited to suggest ideas. You can email them to myself and Marissa, and then with that also, Marissa is the acting Great Salt Lake coordinator for now until we permanently fill that position. We're hoping to see how the legislative session plays out and whether or not there's any other positions that we might be able to distribute that workload before we permanently fill it. So Marissa's your account for all things Great Salt Lake. That was a
All right. I have a motion to
adjourn.
Thank you, Tom. Second. Any opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff.